I'm Robert Banks, and my background is in teaching in universities and seminaries, mainly about the role of God's people in the Bible, in history, and today, both in the church and also in the world at large. Over the last 15 years with my wife Linda, been researching and writing 4 books on the contribution of women, mainly from Australia, who lived and worked in China for around about half a century. And during that time, we've been delighted and privileged to be able to go to China several times to various provinces, including Fujian and Jiangsu, Shandong, Guangdong, and several times to Hong Kong.
Hello, my name is Linda Banks, and my background is as a school teacher originally, and then I became a pastor in a number of churches, and I worked a lot with university students on campus and loved to do that, and particularly worked with international students in Australia, some from the mainland, Chinese from the mainland, which was fun. This book, In the Province of the Dragon, tells the story of Robert's grandmother. His grandmother had an older sister, and her name was Sophie Newton. So it's Robert's relative who spent her whole life working in China, seeking to serve the Chinese people. She went to Fuzhou in 1897. And she felt that she was so convinced that God was calling her to go to China that she had actually been proposed to be married to a young man in Australia, and she turned him down. She said, "No, I really believe this is the way for me to go." And so she prepared for spending some time in Australia before she went. So she worked in migrant churches with Chinese people, because Chinese people have been in Australia since the 1850s. And so there were lots of Chinese people here. So she got to know them, a little about their culture. And she spent some time training at Deaconess Institute in Sydney. And apart from a few short periods of breaks when she coming back home, she usually had a break every 7 years, which is a long time to be away. She hardly saw her family. She was in China for 35 years. And it was because she was getting older, she was in her mid-60s, that she decided that it was she had better come back permanently, something she did not want to do because she was just not well enough, particularly to cope with the very intense summers that southern China has. And so she would have preferred to stay back in China and to have died there. She lived for a very long time, though. She only died in 1958. She was 91. So it was because she was our ancestor. And Robert actually met her not very long before she died. She was this, lovely old lady, not very well, and she really died the next year. But he actually met her, and he was very nervous about that because she was very Christian and he was a young Christian. But she gave him her journals, letters that she'd written to people in China and back home again, photos. She gave him her Bible, her prayer book, and some devotional writings, which contained little fragments of material that she had kept, both written in Chinese and in English. And she said to him, "I know that you're a Christian and you have an interest in history, so I'm hoping that one day you might tell my story." Which was, for a 15-year-old boy to be told that by a 90-year-old woman is quite weird. So we eventually wrote the story. Robert tried to find material many years ago when he was studying in Cambridge, but that didn't happen. but it wasn't till about 2000 that we really, in the early 2000s, that we started to discover some of this material.
It wasn't really until around 2000 that the archives of the Christian organization she worked with in China became available, and we were able to read in detail about what she did. And it was also about the same time that our own newspapers were digitalized, and we found, much to our surprise, around 150 articles on her, some small, some larger, but they recorded talks that she gave, not only about her time in China, but about China itself, about its people, its customs, its society. And so she informed them, often through lectures in different cities, towns, and smaller villages, about those sorts of things. We also were able, of course, to look at scholarly books that had come out on the late Qing period and on the early Republican period up until around 1950 or so. And we were very happy to make, at that stage, our first visit to China, to Fujian, basically, in which we were shown the various places where she lived and where she worked. This was quite wonderful, especially discovering that some of them, although in a dilapidated state, still existed, and we could actually walk and feel where she had actually been all that time ago.
Well, during the first part of her time she went to Fuzhou to start. She helped found schools for school children, and she educated girls, which of course was a very important thing to do at the beginning of the 1900s, because education for girls was very limited. Then she was involved in women's training schools because she realized that she needed to educate their mothers and those people around that age bracket. And so she set up a mission station that included a hospital and guest quarters for visitors in Fencheng, which used to be called Lianjiang in Fuzhou province. And she helped to establish a church there as well. And she also worked at other, what you might call social issues, kinds of important things for the society around. It wasn't just Christianity that she was interested in. Obviously she was, but she was interested in too issues like infanticide. Baby girls, particularly baby girls, but were often left by their parents who could not afford to raise them, and they were left in these places like mission stations. She was also very against child marriage, little girls being promised to a very older man, and worked as best she could in that culture with other Chinese women as well as her own missionary colleagues against that, and later on the practice of foot binding. As time went on, she became involved also in her local district in the issue of opium addiction, and she was part of a committee that went around trying to dissuade, because of the Republican movement becoming more and more openly becoming the government. She was caught up in that, and so she wanted to educate. She was the only woman, I think, who was involved in it in that particular place, and she wanted to show Chinese people that it was wrong, because and it's because that Western trade had brought that about. It wasn't just, something that Chinese people did that was bad. It was to do with the West. So she campaigned against that. She's very, very socially conscious and aware.
One of her main contributions in educating women particularly, not first just as girls, but later as adults and married women was to help them find a skill that they could use in order to start a small family business and gain some extra money for the family from that. It's one of the things that she did, particularly when she moved from Fencheng to Fuzhou. She also sought to find money during her trips back in Australia, which could support poor or orphan girls to be educated. Their families did not have the wherewithal to do that, but she found people back home who supported various girls, not only when they were at school, but later when they went on to train to become nurses or teachers in university arrangements in Fuzhou. There was quite a lot of information about this, not only in her own letters, but also in various talks that she gave back in Australia.
So obviously, one of the really big issues was language, and the first challenge was learning the local dialect. In those days, Western missionaries tended to not learn Mandarin, as you all can understand each other now, but they learnt the local dialect. The Fuzhou dialect is very difficult even now for Chinese speakers, so we understand, but it was also very difficult then. She was good at languages and she passed all her language exams, but she needed to have local Christian people who could help her, local women who could help her learn the language, or not just women, there were men who were teachers as well. So she learned it. I mean, the tonal language is very hard for Australians anyway to learn, because we have a very flat sounding accent. I don't know whether you can hear that. And she did a lot of traveling with to different little villages around to try and bring help to them or to tell them the gospel or whatever it was. She traveled, itinerated around, and so she often traveled with Bible women, as they were called, who helped teach her the language, who helped to introduce her to the culture, and also make it acceptable for her visit to that village. As time went on, she knew those people and she knew the language, but at the beginning that was an issue. Another challenge that faced all missionaries in that era was just contracting illness. But that was an issue for Chinese people as well in that era, like dysentery or typhoid or some kind of malaria, cholera issues like that. There were cases of missionaries in that era who were caught up in the plague as well, and we know that people had leprosy and all sorts of terrible diseases which didn't really surface as much in the West. Sophie had an extra issue, which was that she used to get chronic migraines. That meaning, every month or a couple of months she would be just laid low with no ability to kind of do much. She just was so exhausted from the migraine. She had to sometimes go to hospital, and there was no known cure. I don't think there really is for very extreme migraines now either in Australia anyway. So she needed a slow, quiet place where she could go. And of course, China is not the quietest place to be. So there was also the danger of ever-present cyclones or epidemics which would come up during the summer months. In the countryside, there was the possibility, as she itinerated, of the danger of bandits as time went on, and robbers. And we could tell you stories about things that happened to other missionaries. Sophie was fairly safe most of the time, but other missionaries were not so, it wasn't so good for them. There were people who had been killed because they were out on their own, particularly women. So they are some of the immediate issues, besides missing her own family. And she wrote back. Of course, communication in that era was just very slow. It took about 4 weeks for a letter to get to Australia and then get the receiving end. And her mother at that time got sicker and sicker. And so she felt very much she missed knowing what was wrong with her. So the way she navigated it, I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you exactly everything about that, but she certainly felt very sustained by God and God's care for her. And her journals talk about that, times when God met with her and helped her, and she read stuff in the Bible that was helpful for her at that time. She had really good colleagues that loved her, and they became friends. In fact, there were 3 Australian women working together at one time, and they just got on very well. They supported each other, they travelled with each other, they loved each other as family, really. The local Christians, Chinese Christians, were also becoming more and more and more her family. And so they gave her great strength. They loved having the missionary women there, and so they nurtured them and were hospitable and so on. And there are lots of examples of them being invited to weddings and various occasions, which opening up their homes for Sophie and her colleagues to go to. And of course, people in Australia prayed for China. They prayed that God would use Sophie and her friends from either Australia or from China to serve him. Sometimes the local authorities in place, like in Fuzhou, were very helpful. They realised that the missionaries were there to help the society and not just to make it Western or Christian or something. And so they often gave them help when there was a potential danger or a threat. They would give them information about that to protect them.
Evacuate?
Yeah, like on occasion they were told they needed to evacuate because there was a threat from the north coming down, and so they gave them that kind of tip off as to what to do. Yeah, and I think that rather than hampering the ministry, those difficult situations, as often can be the case today, draw us together as God's people rather than, and actually don't hamper the ministry, that the ministry is strengthened because you go through it together with brothers and sisters, whether they come from China or whether they come from Australia.
It certainly was a tumultuous period, and while some of the tumultuous things happened at a distance from her, others came quite close. For example, during the nationalist revolution in the mid 1910s, 11s into 12, troops actually marched through the city where she was staying and camped even outside the mission compound for several days, which was rather unnerving, but the relationships were good. These were troops moving north from the south to try and establish the revolution, and the population and authorities in Fujian were generally very supportive of them and what they were seeking to do. Later in her stay, when she was assisting the church to deal with a problem that had arisen in one of the other mission stations, on her journey she was confronted by the armed son of the local warlord, who was rather belligerent, wanted to know why she was there, what she was doing. That was a little threatening, but she managed to handle the situation quite well, partly with some good humour, and everything worked out quite well. Later, when student protests and riots erupted in Fuzhou, some of the missionaries, as Linda has mentioned, had to evacuate for some weeks or a few months. But once things settled down again, they were able to resume the work that they were doing. So it was a tumultuous period, and in the ways that Linda has mentioned, of faith in God, the help of local Chinese, prayer from Australia, the support of provincial authorities and local authorities, she was able to manage all of this quite well. and not just to survive it, but to actually deepen her faith and her commitment through it. It was very interesting what happened from the very beginning, partly because it took a while to master the language and she was still trying to learn the local customs. Whenever she was out in the village where she began to work and the city of Fencheng, or when she was traveling to other villages and towns in her district, she always had with her, insisted on having with her, a Chinese companion, one of the Bible women whom she had been spending time helping to train for their work. She had gotten close to some of these people because in the 3 months residential Bible women's schools, she not only taught them or ate with them, but actually moved in to the house where they were staying and lived with them rather than staying in the house where the other missionaries lived. She wanted to get to know them closely, so she built relationships with them, which meant that when they went together, two of them, she and one of these women, for several weeks on a tour around the district, they had a good relationship, and she could depend on that woman to help her understand language she didn't understand, help her understand customs that she didn't understand, help her find entrance into women's homes in order to spend time with them and teach them. A second big help in all of this was that about 10 years into her stay, or a little earlier, she came to know a woman who had been left by her husband with 2 children, and she came to the mission station to find help, not knowing what to do. She didn't have much money, she didn't have anywhere to stay, and Sophie was so concerned for her that after further discussion, the woman said to her, "Would you be willing to help look after my children, because I can't do it any longer?" And Sophie not only said yes to that, but actually adopted the 2 children. She helped raise them. She helped, of course, educate them.
The mother was still there.
The mother was still around, but Sophie became the extra woman in the family. In fact, when we finally met one of these children whose parent was one of the 2 children that she adopted, the little girl said, "I always called her grandma." Quite lovely, actually. So this action of taking in a family as part of her own family became quite widely known and drew her closer to not only the Chinese who came in and out of the mission station, but the Chinese in the village where she lived, and then the city where she lived, and made them more equal, I suppose. Made those people feel more closely warm about her, and of course made her feel much more close and warm to them. I think that was a very significant thing that took place in her life.
Female missionaries, when they worked in Fuzhou, always worked through a catechist who was a male. So they never went and said, "We are in charge of this church." They always worked through the existing structure, the Chinese structure. So it was with a catechist who was generally a younger pastor, and they helped him and the rest of the church build the church and grow the church. sometimes literally, physically with their hands. They helped to build the building because it was, a new thing. And they also became, the missionaries eventually, when they got to know the language and the culture, became part of the what was happening in the main church as well. The sending, the bigger church, not just the small village church, but the ones in Fuzhou itself. There came, and in the Anglican system, which is part of where she's working, there was a new bishop who was appointed from Ireland, and he was very progressive. About 1917, he came to the province, and she helped him make sure that any meetings they had with local pastors was all in Chinese. It was not in English. She said, no, this is what we're going to do. This church is Chinese. We belong to the Chinese church, not our own church, the Chinese church. So she did whatever she could to introduce Chinese customs and culture to those who were Westerners. And she also modeled, I suppose, what it meant to be a woman serving in the church. She helped to train young women who wanted to become deaconesses like her. In fact, she was appointed the first deaconess, Anglican deaconess, in the region in 1922. And other people, of course, said, other women, I could do that. I want to do that. I want to serve God that way. Or I want to serve God by being a doctor or a fully trained nurse, or whatever it was. They could see that these women who came into their lives were just like them. They could do that. And it gave them strength to study. And generally, I mean, on the whole, missionaries, you could say, did a lot of things that you wouldn't want to do, but they did some great things. And one of them was to model to Chinese women what it means to get a good education and to be able to step up and serve God and serve the society that way.
I think there were two things there. The first one I've already mentioned, that from the beginning, for whatever reason, Sophie wanted to partner with the Chinese believers, not be the one who was in charge all the time and doing what needed to be done and allowing them just to do small things around the edges. She relied upon them, she helped train them, she worked with them, and that was just part of her style. I think stemming not just from the kind of person she was, but also from her reading of the Bible and seeing in books like the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters how much key women played a role in taking the Christian faith to others and also being significant people in their local churches. But the other thing was, she was, and I can confirm this from having met with her, a very humble person. She was never preoccupied with, oh, I have these gifts, I have this training, how can I make use of it with some people somewhere for God? That wasn't the way she thought. Right through her time in China, the question she was always asking was, what is the need that's most apparent? Who are the people who have the need? Where are those people? I am willing to go wherever, to whoever, in whatever way, in order to help them. That was what she wrote in her journals quite often. And she had sort of no concern to shape who she should be with, what she should do, or how she should do it. But she also always wanted to find out from the local situation and people where she and how and who she could help. Even when she did that and good things came out of it, we know from what she wrote in her later attitude that she often talked about, that she didn't feel she achieved very much. She said, well, God might have done a few things through me, but she never promoted herself in any significant way. So in both these respects, she was very humble. And I think this mixture of cross-cultural ministry involving partnership at its core and a humble attitude to who you are and what you do is critical, really, to its success. I think that's the main thing I would want to say. The first book in the Flower Mountain Quartet, Children of the Massacre, describes an uprising in the mountains outside Fuzhou, really in inner Fujian, in which a local group of people, men who were armed, sought to take control of their own district and oppose the provincial government, as well as, of course, further afield, the central government in the north. This was in 1895. They did this during the Japanese invasion of part of China, thinking that they could establish their own little lordship, their own little region in which they were the ones in control. While the troops from Fuzhou, the provincial capital, were on their way to stop them, they attacked a mission base in the mountains and killed 9 missionaries and 2 children. This was a terrible event, and it was felt deeply not just by the people in the region, but also in Fuzhou itself, not just the Westerners who knew these missionaries closely, but also the provincial authorities who were very opposed to what this group was doing. One of the people killed, along with his wife and 2 of his children, Sophie had heard speak, and she was influenced by him in part to go to China, and would have hoped to have served with him in that mission station which was attacked. So the first book talks about not just that event, but the extraordinary fact that 6 children who survived from this family, partly because some of them were away overseas being taught at the time, and partly some of them who were not injured or killed by the attackers, all of them over the next 30 years felt a call from God to come back to China and work there, served there as missionaries for anywhere between 4 or 5 years to 40 or so years. 2 of them even died in China, having just survived the Japanese invasion. This story became so widely known in Australia that it influenced not just Sophie, but many female missionaries in particular, female Christians in particular, to respond to a call to go to China to serve God. That's the first volume. The second volume, They Shall See His Face, tells the story of a second relative of ours, more remote relative, Amy Wilkinson, who also knew this story of what had happened to these missionaries when they were killed, and had also heard Robert Stewart speak in Australia before all that happened, and was going to join him in the place where the missionaries were actually killed. But when, of course, that happened, she couldn't do that, so she went to China anyway, and ended up being the senior missionary in the place where Sophie came to first serve. So these 2 Australians were together. There was actually a third one, one of the first all-women's mission stations anywhere in China, so far as we know. And this second woman, Amy Oxon, went on to establish an extraordinary ministry to blind children, first in that village, then in Fuzhou. It became so nationally known that one of the presidents of China gave it an award, the most honourable award any foreigner could receive, and it became internationally known and received attention from the Queen of England when some of the students from the blind school were taken on a visit there. This is the book.
School still exists.
The one book which has been translated into Chinese, and the blind school still exists in Fuzhou. We have visited it, been warmly welcomed there, and is one of the leading institutions for people who are disabled in the city. The third volume is the one that's about Sophie herself. And then the fourth volume is called Through the Valley of the Shadow. Most of the Australian women who went to China who were mentioned in that were influenced also by the horrific murder of the original missionaries in 1895, but also influenced by the fact that people like Sophie and her senior colleague and relative Amy had gone and were working in China. This book tells the story of 8 of these people, all of whom knew each other, but worked in different parts of China during periods of armed conflict in their regions, either from local warlords, from the Japanese invasion, or in some cases the civil war between the nationalists and the communists between 1945 and 1949 into 50. These women suffered the same deprivations and hardships as the Chinese people that they were working with. At points they were in the actual crossfire or captured and put in prison. And they worked in all sorts of places, not just churches, but hospitals, orphanages, universities, schools, relief centres. A couple of them were even held for ransom by bandits for some months before they were safely released. So that's what the final book in the Flower Mountain Quartet is about.
She would be thrilled by the fact that there are so many Christians who are running their own churches, who are seeking to live godly lives in China 21st century. She would be amazed, I think, at just how strong the churches are, and she would want to come and live there. And she would be able to see that the effort and the sacrifice that she might have thought about making at the beginning of her life was worth it, that God indeed used the missionaries there in something that they never could see, of course, because all of the missionaries were asked to leave and when the communists took over. But to think that, the churches would be growing and being so strong is a wonderful thing. So I think she would, if she could see from heaven, I think she would be running around, jumping around, very, very excited about that.
I thought of her when we were visiting one of the 2 main churches in Fuzhou. It was a Friday night, and we were just taken around the various places where people were meeting. There were meetings everywhere. This room, that building, some other building, some tiny little space that hardly anybody could get into. There were hundreds of people meeting, doing different things. And in each room that we passed, you could hear people speaking, you could hear energy, you could hear laughter, you could hear prayer, you could hear the Bible being read.
Music,
I cannot think of a single church that I've visited in Australia in which so much was going on at the same time,
and so
involving so many people with so much life. And I thought, if Sophie could have been here walking around with us, she would have had the time of her life. One other thing that I think about, which connects with her, as a result of being in Fuzhou, we were introduced to one of the descendants of the young boy and the young girl whom she adopted. And that woman introduced us also to one of the daughters of those two people, Mrs. Maurong, who at that stage was 92 years old, still alive. And she was the one who called Sophie grandma, still called her grandma, and had links with her long after Sophie came back to Australia. So Sophie often wrote to her, knitted jumpers for her, wrote letters to her, prayed for her, and so on. We met also through this woman, initial woman, and Mrs. Maurong, the wider family that they all came from. There were about 30 to 40 people met together in a hotel lobby. All of them wanted to meet us, and of course we were keen to meet them. We had a lovely time together. Many of them didn't speak Chinese, didn't speak English, so we had to have translation through Chinese. There were people there in their 90s, 70s, 50s, 30s, even down to their 10s, little children and so on. At the end of the meeting, one of the men said, "This has been a lovely occasion, and it's a pity Sophie couldn't be here, because," I'm partly laughing, partly crying, he said, "without her adopting the little boy and the little girl that she did, none of these people would have existed. They wouldn't have even lived, let alone the majority of them are Christian, have become Christian and stayed Christian. And that's what they realise is important to them, and that's how they live."
Another thing that Mrs. Maurong said to us was, in translation, of course, she said, all through the hard times, and she was meaning the Cultural Revolution, when it was really tough to be a Christian, she said, all through the hard times, I kept the faith in my heart. In other words, the things that she'd learnt as a young girl, through the missionaries, through church, God had etched them into her heart. And when the tough times came, they were still there. She could still serve God and know God. So that was very special to us. And we know Sophie would be, Mrs. Maurong has now gone to heaven. She died just a couple of years ago. She was 100. And we know that in heaven, she and Sophie will be having a good conversation. We're not sure which dialect it'll be in, but it'll be happening, we know.
We've been deeply encouraged on every visit by Chinese Christians, and that's partly why we love going so much to China. We enjoy it each time, and I think our only words would be, keep up the good life that you're living, keep up your spirits, which are so committed and at times so joyful, and working so much to not only display the Christian message, but to bring all the practical things to people who are in need, are poor, who are bereaved, who are suffering famine or flood or whatever it might be in any part of China. Just continue to do what you are doing, serving the Lord, serving the people, serving the country, because increasingly people in other countries like our own are learning about this, are beginning to pay attention to this.
Through the China Christian Daily?
Partly through the China Christian Daily, partly through these little books that we write, which tell them what's going on that they don't know about. And we say to them, look, those of you who travel a bit, travel to China sometimes and just hang out there, just look around, enjoy the country, meet some of the people, go to church, whatever church you find or happen to belong to, and you will be encouraged. You'll go thinking, oh, I'm going to encourage them, but actually you'll be encouraged by them first before you offer them any encouragement yourself. I think this is our words to Chinese Christians and to our local believers as well.
And we look forward to the day that in heaven there'll be people from every tribe and tongue and nation, and lots of those will be Chinese, all meeting together under the shadow of the throne of the Lamb, and praising him together. It's a lovely image, and we all belong to it.